So are all sins equal? That is what we'll be covering in today's lesson. So in modern American culture, I'd say the vast majority of people, if you were to ask them who have a Christian background of some kind, are all sins equal? They would automatically say yes. That would be the vast majority of people. From what I've gathered in my life, that's the vibe that I get. And the fact is it's more than just a yes or a no. And I would say it's both yes and no. And we'll see how that is the case in today's lesson. So first, how all sin is equal. Yes, I agree with that. For the people that say all sin is equal, that is true. So let's talk about why that is. So sin is missing the mark. It's an archery term of missing the bullseye. And so when we sin, we fall short of God's holy standard. We deviate from his set plan and we do things our own way in rebellion to him. And so the Bible tells us in Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Romans 6:23 says, for the wages of sin is death. And so all people have sinned. It says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So, and this is maybe the key verse besides those and others, but one of the key verses for this concept of all sin being equal would be from James 2 verse 10, where it says, for whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. So whenever it's saying this, we would understand it to say that whether you do a big sin or a small sin, any sin separates us from God, and we become a lawbreaker before a holy and a perfect God. So that is the way in which all sin is equal, and it is the same in the sense of how it separates us from holy, perfect God. So we see that all sin is equal, but now, and there is a big but there, all sin is also not equal. So yes, all sin is equal in the sense that all sin, whether stealing a pack of gum or $1 billion or hitting somebody or, cheating on your taxes, all of those things fall short of God's glory. But all sin is not the same and it is not equal in the sense of the effects and the punishments that go along with it. Now, there will be a lot of verses that I'm going to be throwing out, and honestly, I could have used more. I'm going to try there are a lot of verses that I could use, and we'll see how many I end up keeping in the video. But the fact is this concept of differences in punishments for sin is spoken of numerous times in the Bible, oftentimes in verses that we just read and we don't think much of it. But when we look at it, we will see what it is implying in the words of there being a difference in sins that the Bible speaks of. So God gave the law of Moses, and when he did that, there were distinctions in the law for the penalties of breaking the law. So there were some sins that were so grievous, they were required to put that person to death. Then there were other sins that they were to exile the person from the community. Luke 17:2 says, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were cast into the sea than that he should cause one of these little ones to sin. So he doesn't say that about all the sins. He doesn't just say, well, if you sin at all, it would be better if you were just thrown into the sea with a millstone around your neck. But he says specifically, if you sin against children, it would be better for you to just die now than to go and sin against innocent children. So Jesus is drawing some very strong words about judgment upon the person who sins against children. Now, before just giving examples of how the Bible speaks of how not all sin is equal in its effect, we will just talk for a bit about what makes certain sins more grievous. There are three important factors to consider for what makes certain sins more grievous in God's sight. The first is how much we know about God and his ways will determine, at least partially, the judgment that goes with it. So with the light that we have been given, how we choose to neglect that will determine the punishment for that. So a person who hears the truth day after day, or they go to a church every Sunday and they're hearing truth and they're unfazed and unmoved by that, they will have a more strict judgment than a person who sins but has never really heard the gospel. They've never really gone to church before. Sin will always separate us from God, but the severity of it will differ. So in Luke 12:47 and 48, it talks about how some will be beaten with many stripes and some will be beaten with few stripes. And it says, from everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. So the more revelation we have about God, the more responsible we are to God. And those that have been given much will be beaten with many stripes, because how we choose to act upon what God has given to us will determine that. Now, another way in which we can see that not all sin is equal is the second principle would be in terms of whether we intended to sin or not. Intentional and unintentional sins would play a factor in this. Numbers 15 verses 27 through 31 would point to this. A person who sins deliberately versus not on purpose would be a difference there. So another way in which sins can be seen as more or less serious would be by the effect that they have on others, or how great of an impact it can have on others. So James tells us not many people should become teachers, because those who become teachers will be judged with a stricter judgment. Is saying this because these teachers will influence others. So to deceive or to hurt others' correct thinking of God will have a stricter judgment than just a random person. So then it says, and if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town. Truly I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. So Jesus is saying this town will have greater judgment than Sodom and Gomorrah. And he's trying to say with the more light that was given to them will determine the judgment that God will have upon them. Now, some people will point to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount whenever he talks about if you have hate in your heart, it's the same as murder, or if you lust, it's the same as adultery. What he is describing there is not to say that those are the same actions, but to say that those both separate the person from God. He's not trying to say you might as well just sleep with this person as opposed to look at something because they're both equally bad. He's saying they're both equally bad in terms of they separate you from God. You are not either going to have a relationship with God, or you're going to be further far from God because of your sin. So what Jesus was describing is that those are both sinful activities, lust and adultery, or murder and hate. He's describing those are all sins, but he's not saying that they are all equal. So all sin is not equal in its effect. To murder somebody and to cheat on your taxes are both equally sins, and both of those sins would send somebody to hell. So if a person does not repent of their sins, now all of us have sinned much more than one time, but whether it's stealing a pack of gum or killing 5 people, those sins separate us from holy God, and just judgment would be upon us, deservedly so. So all sin is equal in that sense, but not all sin is equal in terms of the judgment with which those sins will have. So murdering somebody not only affects that person, obviously, and their family and friends and loved ones here on this earth, but it also, there's a difference when you take the life of another person made in the image of God versus stealing $5 from your mom's purse. Both are not good, but both are very different as well. So John 19:11 is one of my favorite verses for this concept. It says, "You would have no authority over me at all," Jesus answered him, "if it hadn't been given you from above. That is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." I mean, if that was the only verse in the Bible that we had for this, that would be all that we need. Jesus says, plain as day, that The person, Judas, who delivered him over to Pilate had committed the greater sin. He didn't say he committed a sin or an equal sin. He said this sin that Judas committed is even more dastardly and evil than what Pilate was getting ready to do. Mark 12:40 says, "They devour widows' houses and say long prayers just for show. These will receive harsher judgment or stricter condemnation," whatever your translation says, but it says either harsher judgment or stricter condemnation. He's saying that these people who are doing these prayers just for show will receive stricter condemnation or greater judgment. He doesn't say it'll all be equal or it's all the same. He's saying, no, these people who are hypocrites are going to have it worse than those that weren't hypocrites. So then it goes on in Ezekiel 8 verse 6, it says, Ezekiel's talking, he said, "But you will see greater abominations." So this passage declares that some abominations or sinful actions are greater than others. Matthew 5:19 says, "Whoever breaks one of the least of these commands." So I guess to summarize, it would be worth noting that all sin is equal. All sin does separate us from God. The smallest to the greatest, one sin is one sin too many to get somebody to heaven on their own. That's why we need a Savior, because all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But all sin is not equal in terms of the punishments that those can have. The degrees and levels of the sins that people commit do differ based on the severity of those things. So anyways, I hope that was informative for you. If you have not subscribed to my channel and you feel like this has been beneficial, I would just ask that if you would be able to subscribe, would greatly appreciate it. Okay, thank you. See you next time.